Okay, let's unpack this. You've given us a stack of source material that promises a truly fascinating and, for many, I think, quite challenging deep dive.
Absolutely.
We're exploring a scholarly examination that takes a very different look at familiar religious narratives, specifically those found in the Judeo-Christian Bible.
That's right. Our mission in this deep dive is basically to act as your guides through this particular source. And it presents arguments that the Judeo-Christian Bible is, well, in fact, a work of fiction.
A work of fiction, that's a strong claim right out of the gate.
It is, and it builds this case by drawing heavily on comparisons with much older mythologies, applying historical analysis, and examining the biblical text itself through a more scholarly rather than purely theological lens.
It's definitely a perspective shift, and the source material itself highlights this right away. It makes a really significant claim that there are literally thousands of scholarly books and articles out there that collectively refute every single part of the Judeo-Christian Bible.
Yeah, thousands. And the source argues that this body of, what it calls unchallengeable proof that the Bible is fictional is kind of astonishingly unknown to maybe 90% of the population in Christian-dominated societies.
90%. That's a pretty bold statement. So it's saying this scholarship exists, it's out there in academic circles, maybe university libraries.
Exactly. But it hasn't really permeated popular understanding. It's like a vast amount of knowledge is sort of locked away in these dense academic works, requiring immense effort maybe to access and piece it all together.
Sure, and that's where this deep dive comes in for you, the listener.
Right. The source aims to bridge that gap if you want to be well-informed. It seeks to distill some of that scattered information, presenting arguments that might otherwise stay hidden. It suggests you might be missing out on a significant body of critical information about these really foundational texts.
Which brings us to a core argument the source makes about the very method used by many today to interpret these texts: theology itself. The source claims that theology, as it's practiced in divinity faculties in the modern era, has kind of developed into a methodology specifically used to, well, distort evidence.
This is a really critical point in the source's overall argument. It's argued that the objective of this methodology isn't necessarily an unbiased search for truth, but rather to make the Bible appear to be nonfiction, to validate pre-existing beliefs.
Right. So it's presented almost as a tool or maybe a method that's kind of bent towards a predetermined outcome rather than letting the evidence lead.
That's the argument, yes.
How does the source contrast this with, say, earlier approaches to theology?
Well, source suggests that earlier theologians didn't really need to simulate scientific methods because, science as we understand it today just didn't exist in the same way.
Okay.
In that era, according to the source, believers often accepted conclusions based more on emotional satisfaction, maybe. They weren't necessarily equipped to scrutinize the methods used because the whole concept of rigorous, verifiable methodology wasn't quite there yet.
Right. The scientific method wasn't the standard framework. And the source claims this modern theological approach, the one designed maybe to make the Bible seem like history, it worked because, according to the source, believers generally lacked the technical competence, perhaps, to judge the methods being employed to support the claims.
Precisely. It fundamentally challenges the idea of theology as a neutral or objective academic pursuit, framing it instead as more of a mechanism for faith validation.
So, a way to maintain the perception of factual accuracy.
Even when, from the source's perspective, the evidence, especially when you look at it through a historical and comparative lens, points somewhere else entirely. The source argues this method focuses on interpreting the text to fit the belief, rather than letting external evidence shape how you understand the text's nature.
Okay, now let's zoom out a bit, because the source doesn't just critique the methods of interpretation. It spends a lot of time highlighting some pretty startling parallels between biblical narratives and myths that predate them by centuries, sometimes even millennia.
Yeah, this is a huge pillar of the source's argument for the Bible being, well, fictional in nature.
Yeah.
It points to these recurring story patterns across vastly different ancient cultures.
Suggesting borrowing, or maybe just a shared kind of mythological evolution rather than unique historical events happening just once.
Exactly. That's the core idea.
And one of the most striking parallels the source presents is the figure of the resurrected Savior. The claim is that the concept of a deity, or maybe a key figure, dying and rising from the dead, it's not unique to the story of Jesus at all. It appears in myths that are much, much older.
Absolutely. The source specifically names the Egyptian savior god Osiris. He's noted for rising from the dead, and he appears in mythology dating back, some 3,000 years before the time of Jesus.
3,000 years, that's a long time before.
It is, and it goes back even further. The source mentions a savior goddess named Easter, who it claims was associated with death and resurrection thousands of years before Osiris.
Wow, thousands of years before Osiris. That pushes this pattern back incredibly far.
It does. And the source says it wasn't just these two either. It lists a whole host of other cultures between the time of Osiris and Jesus, Greek, Assyrian, Phoenician, Persian, Hittite, Chinese, and apparently over a dozen others that had savior god figures who were also noted for rising from the dead.
A dozen others, so it's really widespread.
That sheer prevalence, yeah. The motif across such a wide range of geographically and culturally distinct societies is presented by the source as strong evidence that this was a common mythological trope, like a narrative pattern, rather than a unique historical occurrence that happened only once with Jesus.
So the suggestion is the story was perhaps adopted or evolved from these much older narratives.
That's the implication, yes.
Yeah,
It tapped into a pre-existing narrative structure.
It's about seeing a common thread, really, woven through human storytelling across millennia. The source also points to parallels not just in characters, but in the very concepts of deities and even, legal systems.
Yes. For instance, the source mentions the worship of a three-person goddess in some ancient cultures, centuries before the concept of a three-person god appears in the biblical book of Ijam.
A three-person goddess. Okay. So that suggests the idea of a divine entity expressed as a kind of trinity wasn't original to the biblical context either.
Not according to this source, no. And the comparison of law codes is particularly compelling in the source material. It contrasts the biblical narrative of the volcano god Yahweh dictating a law code to Moses on Mount Sinai,
Right.
with the Babylonian sun god Shamash dictating an almost identical law code to King Hammurabi.
Hammurabi's code. Okay, I know that one.
Exactly. But the key here is the timing. According to the source, the Hammurabi law code dates back maybe 1,000 years before the time traditionally associated with Moses receiving the Ten Commandments.
It's 1,000 years earlier.
Yeah. This significant time difference, combined with the related similarities in the content, is presented as evidence that the biblical law code was, borrowed from a much older Mesopotamian source.
And the source pushes this even further, claiming the Ten Commandments specifically, the cornerstone of Judeo-Christian law, were not only borrowed from an earlier god, but were actually composed by different hands some 400 years after the traditional death date of Moses.
Right, so that's a direct challenge to the idea of them being directly revealed, divine law, delivered at one specific historical moment. It fundamentally redates and reattributes their origin, placing them squarely within a later human compositional process, potentially influenced by existing legal traditions like Hammurabi's.
Wow, okay. The source also argues that even core concepts, ideas like a chosen people or a promised land, weren't original ideas unique to the Judeo-Christian narrative.
Right. These are presented as concepts with roots in earlier cultural or regional ideas, maybe reflecting the common experience of various groups believing they had a special destiny or claims to a particular territory. The source argues these weren't divinely revealed unique concepts, but rather common motifs adapted into the biblical narrative.
Okay, so the picture emerging from the source is one of recurring mythological patterns, potentially borrowed characters, laws, fundamental concepts, all suggesting that the biblical narratives are built upon a foundation of much older human stories and ideas, adapted and reshaped over time.
That's the central thesis, and this extends even to how the universe itself was understood in these texts.
The cosmology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The source highlights what it calls the primitive cosmography reflected throughout the Judeo-Christian Bible, contrasting it sharply with our modern scientific understanding.
Yeah.
The argument is that the biblical description of the cosmos is just inconsistent with reality, pointing to it as evidence of human authorship based on limited ancient knowledge.
So what are some specifics? The biblical view, as described in the source, it includes details that clash with modern science, right?
It does. For example, Genesis 1.1 mentions the gods making the skies and land, plural.
Plural. Yep.
And in Genesis 1.6 and 1.8, it describes a solid dome called rakiach in the original Hebrew that divides the waters above from the waters below.
A solid dome, like a physical barrier.
That's how the source interprets it, yes. A literal physical barrier holding back a cosmic ocean up there.
Okay. And then during the flood narrative in Genesis 7.11, this cosmic ocean below supposedly gushes up, and the sluice gates in the solid dome of the sky open, letting the waters above pour down.
Exactly. It paints a picture of a very specific, layered cosmos. A flat earth, water below, solid sky, water above.
And there are other points mentioned.
Yeah, the earth floating on water, cited in Exodus 20.4,
Yeah.
and concepts from later biblical books like stars being tiny enough to actually fall to the earth, mentioned in Apocalypse 6.13 and Matthew 2.9.
Tiny stars falling, and the moon being its own light source, not just reflecting the sun.
Genesis 1.16, yeah. Plus the overarching idea that the entire universe was created by the gods less than 10,000 years ago.
Okay, now contrast that with our modern scientific understanding. Big Bang, maybe 13.8 billion years ago, not 17, but certainly billions. Stars and planets forming over vast timescales, from collapsing gas clouds, gravity, stars burning out.
Right. It's a completely different picture.
The source uses this profound difference. The biblical view rooted in a solid sky dome, flat earth on water, tiny stars, recent creation, versus the modern scientific view of a vast, ancient, gravity-driven universe as powerful evidence. Evidence that the biblical authors were operating from a position of what we would now consider, well, fundamental ignorance about the physical world.
The argument is that this just isn't compatible with the idea of divine revelation providing accurate information about the cosmos. It suggests the cosmology in the text is a product of the limited human understanding prevalent in the ancient Near East, not an accurate, timeless description of reality.
And related to this ancient view of the sky, the source points out that despite later religious interpretations often simplifying it to a single heaven, the Bible and related ancient concepts actually refer to multiple skies or heavens.
Indeed. The source mentions the concept of 7 heavens or skies, often seen as corresponding to the 7 known celestial bodies, or sky gods, visible to the ancients: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn.
7 heavens.
Yeah. And it notes that even in the New Testament, Paul of Tarsus refers to being taken up to the 3rd sky in 2 Corinthians 12.2. That indicates this layered cosmology was still present in the thinking of early biblical figures. Some Essene documents contemporary with the New Testament era also endorsed the idea of all 7 heavens.
Huh. And this ancient concept is so ingrained, it even survives in our modern language, like saying someone is in 7th heaven to describe extreme happiness.
Exactly, a remnant of this older, multi-layered view of the cosmos.
Which is tied into ancient astronomy and astrology, as the source describes it. Constellations weren't just random star patterns back then.
Not according to this view. They were deemed to possess tendencies, maybe inflicted by guardian spirits or celestial influence, or sometimes called cherubs.
And the inventors of the zodiac, according to the source, credited constellations with periods of influence based simply on how big they looked.
Pretty much, yeah. Their perceived size or prominence in the night sky. For example, the influence of the constellation Scorpio was supposedly limited to just 6 days because it looked relatively small.
Just based on appearance.
Right. The source contrasts this ancient astrological approach, viewing stars as gods or influenced by them, constellations as meaningful entities, attributing influence based on appearance with our modern knowledge. We know stars are distant burning suns. Constellations are just optical illusions from our perspective on Earth, and the sun's position relative to star patterns has no astrological influence in a scientific sense.
So, the source argues that the biblical cosmology and related ideas are firmly rooted in ancient, pre-scientific astrological and mythical views of the universe, not in any divinely revealed, accurate understanding of reality.
It's presented as another layer of evidence, in the source's view, that these texts are human creations, reflecting the knowledge and beliefs of their specific time and place.
Okay. Moving from the vastness of the cosmos down to early human society, the source delves into the very origins of religion and makes a, well, pretty provocative claim about the role of gender in its earliest forms.
It does. The source suggests that primeval religion, in its earliest stages, was very much a woman's invention.
A woman's invention. How so?
This arose, the source argues, from early human recognition of natural phenomena like the cycles of life, death, fertility, and the concept of the Earth Mother as the source of all life.
That's a powerful counterpoint to many historical accounts that often focus primarily on male religious figures and structures. The source claims the first gods weren't remote, powerful sky gods.
No, but much more accessible Earth gods, often seen as capricious, maybe needing appeasement through rituals or offerings. The Earth itself was widely adored as the mother of all things, providing sustenance and fertility.
And venerated animals played a role.
Yes, her elder children were often animals like birds, horses, sows, cows, goats, whose attributes speed, strength, fertility, providing milk or meat were directly beneficial for human survival and reproduction. These animals were seen as manifestations or powerful offspring of the mother goddess.
But according to the source, this matriarchal or earth mother-focused religious structure didn't remain dominant. A significant shift occurred.
With the rise of complex political hierarchies headed by absolute kings. That's the argument.
So as earthly societies developed these autocratic structures with kings wielding absolute power,
The most indispensable god in the culture's pantheon was promoted to the monarchy of the heavens. This heavenly king was then granted absolute power, mirroring the structure of earthly rule.
like a celestial CEO. The source lists various names used across different cultures for this autocratic heavenly king: Zeus, Shamash, Yahweh, Ra, Elohim, Amen, Sin, Jupiter, Odin, Woden, Godin, Aten, Manitou.
Quite a list. The argument is that the structure of divine power was remodeled to directly reflect the structure of human political power, a single all-powerful male ruler at the top.
And in this patriarchal divine hierarchy, much like with absolute earthly kings, the king of heaven could allegedly do no wrong.
That's the claim. He was credited with causing all deaths. The source mentions the idea, not a sparrow can fall, echoing the ultimate unquestionable authority of earthly kings who might see themselves as the cause or permitter of all events in their realm.
This transition from Earth Mother to male sky god, linked to the rise of patriarchal kingship, is then connected by the source to a particularly sensitive and, frankly, difficult historical claim regarding race and gender in the context of imposed religion.
Yes, this is a very strong claim in the source. It claims that when European or white conquerors enslaved Africans or black people, they intentionally coerced them into abandoning their own indigenous gods and worshiping white male gods who were, in the source's view, created in the conqueror's image.
And the source argues that for black women, this imposition was doubly degrading.
Yes, forcing them to worship deities who were both white and male, representing the identities of their oppressors. The source further states that Christian missionaries continued, and, it implies, continue this practice of imposing their god on other cultures.
Wow. That frames conversion during colonialism not as spiritual sharing, but as a forceful imposition linked directly to power dynamics.
It's presented by the source as a direct consequence of that shift to male-dominated patriarchal religious structures tied to earthly power and conquest religion, becoming a tool to reinforce racial and gender hierarchies established through subjugation.
So the source paints a picture of a foundational shift in religious focus, driven by societal power structures, moving from earth mother worship to male sky gods, and then seeing that shift potentially weaponized through conquest and enslavement, particularly impacting black women.
That's the narrative presented.
This brings us to a related but often darker aspect of ancient religion discussed in the source: sacrifice and ritual, including the idea of consuming the divine.
Right. The source describes an evolution in the practice of sacrifice. It suggests early human societies may have initially sacrificed enemies to the Earth Mother, seeing it perhaps pragmatically, like eliminating waste and feeding the Earth.
Okay. But it evolved.
Over time, this is argued to have evolved into sacrifices seen as the mother's just due, maybe a form of tax or tribute offered to maintain favor or ensure fertility.
And by the 5th century BCE, the source claims this practice, including human sacrifice, was incorporated into some religious systems. It specifically alleges that the Jewish lawgiver had Yahweh order Moses to demand human sacrifice.
Yes, citing a specific biblical passage. The source uses this to argue that even within texts seen as divine law, there's evidence of practices that evolve from much older, potentially brutal ritual traditions.
The source also mentions stories like the Greek myth of Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia, and it claims later versions kind of whitewashed this.
Yeah, the source claims that later retellings, or maybe admirers of Agamemnon, softened this disturbing act, perhaps transferring responsibility or adding details to make it seem less horrific, maybe claiming Iphigenia was beloved and went willingly. This is presented as an example of how myths and religious stories can be actively edited or reinterpreted over time to make them more palatable or align with changing social norms, maybe hiding their darker origins.
Returning to the idea of the Earth Mother and sacrifice, the source discusses a supposed discovery in ancient beliefs that human blood was the mother's favorite food.
This led, it's argued, to a powerful orthodoxy, where the priestess queen held absolute authority as the sole arbiter of who the sacrificial victim should be.
So the priestess queen had the power to choose.
According to the source, yes. This power structure was supposedly so deeply ingrained that even men were conditioned not to question the priestess's right to choose the victim. This reinforces the idea of a powerful female role in early religion before the shift to patriarchal systems.
And then there's the deeply rooted concept of consuming the deity, which the source traces back, what, tens of thousands of years?
That's the claim. The digestion of a sacred object, it's argued, was believed to constitute a mystical union with God.
What kind of sacred object?
Well, the source speculates about very early ones, mentioning the hallucinogenic mushroom, Amanita muscaria. Because it seemed to spring up spontaneously from the earth, maybe under trees connecting earth and sky, it might have been seen as a miraculous offspring of Sky Father and Earth Mother.
So consuming, it was like communing with the divine parents.
Potentially, yeah. And the source draws a direct line from these ancient practices to much later religious rituals. It connects the instructions in the Egyptian Book of the Dead for worshippers of Osiris to eat his flesh and drink his blood in the form of bread and barley wine.
Okay.
With the consumption of the resurrected savior goddess Easter in the form of bread and wine, which the source claims continues to this day.
So the overarching claim is that humans have been engaging in rituals involving the symbolic or literal eating of their gods for 30,000 years, framing modern communion rituals as a continuation of incredibly ancient practices.
That's the argument presented, rooted in achieving mystical union through consuming something deemed sacred or divine.
The source also touches upon the Greek city of Eleusis, famous for its mystery cults.
Right. Salvation mythology was apparently first instituted there, involving reenactments of the goddess Persephone's death and resurrection. Worshippers who participated in these mysteries were believed to be bestowed with immortality.
So these ancient rituals focused on death, rebirth, consuming the divine. They didn't just fade away. According to the source, they evolved or adapted and influenced the development of later religious practices and the social codes and taboos that govern societies.
Exactly. The evolution of belief systems is deeply intertwined with the formation of social rules and taboos. The source discusses sacred kingship and sacrifice, linking savior mythology to observable natural cycles.
Like the moon or seasons.
Yeah, connecting the idea of death as the necessary price of life to cycles like the moon's monthly death and rebirth and the annual cycle of summer and winter. Sacred kings in some ancient traditions are presented as emulating the goddess's voluntary death, sometimes being sacrificed annually, perhaps at the full moon after the vernal equinox, as representatives of the community.
The source ties the Osiris and Set narrative into this too, right? Paralleling Osiris with the biblical Abel.
Yes. Osiris is crowned king, married to the priestess queen. Their union is consummated in the cornfield, which is also his intended burial place. This act, performed in view of the orbiting goddess, the moon maybe, and the population, was allegedly meant to ensure acceptance of the chosen victim.
And Set's role, the 3-day burial.
Set's subsequent 3-day burial, whether in a shallow grave or clay pots, is interpreted by the source as a way to conceal a deception that the king wasn't truly dead or gone forever, allowing for later resurrection or return. The source suggests the biblical Cain and Abel myth might be related to this older sacred kingship narrative.
So it presents these biblical stories as potentially having roots in much older ritualistic narratives involving symbolic death, temporary absence, and return linked to agricultural cycles and sacred kingship.
That's the interpretation offered. The source also tackles the origins of marriage and incest taboos, offering a pretty controversial socio-economic explanation rather than the commonly assumed genetic one.
Socio-economic, not genetic. How does that work?
Well, it points out that Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters for 3,000 years without, it claims, noticeable genetic degeneration issues. Similarly, Greek and Jewish patriarchs commonly married close relatives like unclunnies or first cousins. This is used to challenge the idea that these taboos were primarily driven by an understanding of genetics.
So what's the proposed origin then?
Socioeconomic. The source argues there was a strong tendency for people to mate within their immediate family. Incest taboos were therefore necessary to force exogamy mating outside the immediate family or tribe.
Why was forcing people to marry outside the family or tribe so important?
The source argues it was crucial to prevent a problem faced by fathers who wanted to sell or trade daughters outside the family. If nobody married outside the sibling group, it would be impossible to form alliances, transfer wealth, or establish social ties through marriage beyond the immediate family unit. The taboo, therefore, served to break this strong in-group mating tendency for broader social and economic reasons.
That's a different way of looking at it.
It is. The story of Adonis, born from the mating of Myrrha and Cinyras, is cited. Adonis was famed for his beauty, which the source uses to suggest that the composers of this ancient myth hadn't heard of genetic degeneration theory. further supporting the non-genetic origin of the taboo in their view.
The source also mentions Jewish law requiring the closest male relative to impregnate a childless dead man's widow to produce an heir known as a levirate marriage.
Right. And this heir was legally deemed the dead man's son. Another practice that seems to challenge modern concepts of parentage and genetic lineage, according to the source.
And the source links the advent of dependable contraception to women's ability to reclaim sexual fulfillment, which it claims was stolen by men who controlled marriage and sex through these societal rules.
It even argues the very word virgin changed meaning. Originally perhaps a pejorative term, it allegedly shifted to meaning a woman capable of producing a legitimate heir because no man had ejaculated sperm into her womb before her husband. This redefinition is presented as tied to the need for paternity assurance in patriarchal systems.
Wow, okay. Other key taboos are also assigned approximate dates of origin in the source, like stealing, murder.
Yeah. Stealing within the tribe around 10,000 BCE, murder within the tribe after 10,000 BCE, adultery specifically defined as generating a bastard, implying impregnation around 3,500 BCE, cannibalism in Egypt by 2,500 BCE, and premarital recreation for women around the time of the first Bibles.
So adultery was about illegitimate heirs, not just sex outside marriage.
That's the source's definition here, yes. An impregnation taboo. It claims laws restricted the rape of virgins specifically because their wombs were empty of bastard seed, further highlighting the focus on paternity and inheritance. Infant sacrifice, the source notes, was eventually abolished because live births became too rare to waste, necessitating new methods of tribute.
This discussion of taboos leads into a look at sexuality's complex relationship with religion. The source credits Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, with inventing the idea that abstinence from recreation could be virtuous.
Right, and later sexual taboos, including incest, homosexuality, and the participation of priestesses in certain sexual rites, controversially termed priestess-tupping by the source, are mentioned as having complex reasons explored elsewhere in the source text, often tied back to the control of women and fertility within patriarchal structures.
The source contrasts the free sexual recreation permitted at ancient morning star goddess planting festivals focused on fertility
with the later development of the fornication taboo. It claims this taboo ended the Gentile monopoly on mercenary recreation, suggesting Jews needed an alternative to offering sex to a goddess in certain ritual contexts. It's a bit complex, but seems to link changing sexual norms to the shift away from fertility goddess worship.
The source also discusses anti-fertility god fanaticism and the acceptance of celibacy, particularly by groups like the Essenes, which it links to Jesus.
These are presented as extensions of the subjugation of women and goddesses by male ruling classes, reinforcing male control over sexuality and reproduction.
This detailed look at the evolution of beliefs, rituals, taboos, often linking them to societal structures, power dynamics, practical concerns like inheritance. It really sets the stage for the source's examination of the biblical texts themselves, focusing on their composition and editing.
Exactly. This is a central part of the source's argument that the Bible is a human work, not a perfectly preserved divine text. It asserts that the Torah, the first 5 books traditionally attributed to Moses, was actually created by 6 different men. 6 different men, often with differing viewpoints, whose writings were later combined by an editor, or redactor, leading to internal contradictions.
Does the source name these authors?
It does, drawing on critical biblical scholarship. J, the Yahwist from Judah, focusing on Yahweh. E, the Elohist from Israel, focusing on Elohim. D, the Deuteronomist, focused on law. And P, the priestly author, focused on priestly concerns. Plus the redactor, R, who combined them and added material. The specific identities of 3 of these authors, according to the source, remain unknown.
So R's job was to kind of weave these together.
Right. The source argues R's job was to harmonize J with E, and then make J, E, and D conform to the theology prevalent in R's time, while also incorporating older documents. This process, trying to weave together distinct and sometimes incompatible narratives, is presented as the reason for the Bible's self-contradictions.
And the source gives specific examples of these incompatible narratives layered together, right? Like Noah's flood.
Absolutely. The source points out really stark differences between the J and P accounts found side by side in Genesis. For example, how long was the ground dry after the flood? J says 54 days, P says 364 days. It's a big difference.
Yeah, huge.
How many animals were taken on the ark? J says 2 of each kind, P says 2 of each kind, plus 7 pairs of clean animals. Even the names of Noah's sons differ slightly between the accounts, which impacts later genealogies.
That seems like a pretty clear sign, according to the source, of two different stories about the same event being spliced together without full harmonization. What about creation?
Similar thing. The source highlights differences between J's account in Genesis 2, God formed human from soil first, then animals, then woman from rib, and P's account in Genesis 1, creation over 6 days in a different order, plants first, then animals, then humans, male and female together, made in God's image. It points out that the two Eve creation stories are incompatible due to the redactor's, let's say, poor editing, and that R might have ignored an even older idea of a hermaphrodite human.
There's also that strange repetition of the wife-a-sister anecdote, where the patriarch pretends his wife is his sister to save his own skin.
Right. The source notes this appears 3 times with different characters. Abraham, Sarah, Pharaoh in the J strand, Abraham, Sarah, Abimelech in the E strand, and Isaac, Rebekah in the J strand again. The source claims the E version is pure fiction, arguing that Philistines weren't even in that region until the 12th century BCE, long after Abraham's time.
So these repetitions and contradictions are presented as concrete evidence of multiple authors working independently, whose different versions of similar stories were later combined, maybe clumsily, by an editor who prioritized including the material over perfect consistency.
That's the argument. And beyond just combining, the source claims texts were deliberately expurgated, removed, or censored, and contradictions were sometimes explained away with later additions or glosses by the redactor.
Expurgated. Like,
The alleged stories of Moses' assassination and Noah's castration are cited as examples, noting that Noah's castration story, despite efforts to remove it from the canonical text, actually survived into the Talmud, an important collection of Jewish oral law and commentary.
so even though the editor tried to remove certain uncomfortable stories, remnants survived elsewhere. Interesting.
Exactly. The source also suggests that the Yahwist author's failure to explain Yahweh's seemingly capricious actions like killing Cuza for touching the ark, or nearly killing Balaam for obeying him, implies J saw these divine actions as just beyond mortal comprehension. Later editors might have tried to add rationalizations or explanations.
Ultimately, the source views some biblical reports not as objective history, but as propaganda, intended maybe to promote a particular view or agenda.
Yeah, as an illustration, the source contrasts the biblical depiction of King David's supposed generosity to the Ammonites with the actions of his descendant, King Amatyahu, who allegedly killed 10,000 Edomite prisoners by throwing them off a rock. Right. The source labels the positive portrayal of David as propaganda, designed to enhance the image of Israelite kingship, while the negative portrayal of Amatyahu is presented as potentially more indicative of the reality of ancient warfare and rule, though still potentially biased itself, of course.
So the source argues the biblical text is this complex, layered document, assembled from different authors with conflicting views, edited and censored over time, containing contradictions, elements serving as propaganda, not a unified, divinely inspired historical record.
That's the core assertion.
And this perspective deeply impacts how the source views the figures of kings and messiahs and the political landscape described in the Bible.
It does. The source maintains that the emergence of earthly kings directly influenced the concept of celestial counterparts. With powerful, often autocratic kings on earth, the primary deity was similarly conceived as an absolute monarch in the heavens.
And just like earthly kings held ultimate authority, according to the source, any law attributed to God the King in the biblical text was meant to be obeyed without question.
That's the claim. Regardless of whether the law seemed time-serving, partisan, unjust, sadomasochistic, or illogical from a modern perspective, God the King, mirroring mortal rulers, could do no wrong and was credited with causing all deaths, reflecting a belief that nothing happens without divine will.
A theological reflection of the political reality of absolute monarchy.
That's how the source frames it.
The concept of the Messiah is also discussed as evolving, particularly tied to political hopes specifically, the desire for freedom from foreign overlords.
Right. The source mentions early hopes, like the promise of the royal staff or power to the tribe of Yehuda. It highlights the prophecy by Zechariah concerning Zerubbabel, who was expected to be crowned as both priest and king after the return from exile.
But that didn't happen as predicted, right? Zerubbabel wasn't crowned king.
Correct. According to the source, when Zerubbabel was not crowned, later generations, unwilling to accept that the prophecy had failed, reinterpreted it. They argued it didn't refer to Zerubbabel himself, but to an unborn descendant who had come later, thus transforming a failed prophecy about a contemporary figure into the concept of a future Messiah.
That's a fascinating take on the origin of the Messiah concept. What about later claims of historical fulfillment, like the Maccabees?
The source examines the Hasmonean monarchy, the Maccabees, being seen by some as fulfilling prophecies about a kingdom of saints independent of foreign rule. However, the source notes this kingdom only lasted about a century, again challenging the idea of enduring divine prophecy being fulfilled.
And it makes the controversial claim about the Book of Daniel.
A very controversial one, yes. That the apocalyptic portions are forgery, backdating a prophecy of the Hasmonean monarchy to the much earlier Babylonian times to create the illusion of accurate long-term prediction.
So, the concept of the Messiah is seen by the source as this political idea that evolved and was reinterpreted over time, driven by desires for national liberation and efforts to make prophecies fit historical events, maybe even through alleged forgery.
That's the perspective offered. The source also argues that the very nature of Yahweh transformed over time, from maybe a local volcano god worshipped in Anatolia to a universal sky god.
A volcano god. How does the source support that claim?
It suggests that initially, different groups worshipped Yahweh in multiple forms associated with nature, like a bull, wolf, or oak tree, or linked to specific locations like mountains known for volcanic activity. His arbitrary wrath, as seen in stories like Cuza's death or Balaam's near-death, is presented as characteristic of a volatile, perhaps localized deity.
But over time, the concept expanded.
Yes, particularly with the rise of a centralized priestly caste and changing political circumstances. The source points to later texts, like Psalm 80, which refers to Yahweh not just as a local deity, but as commander of armies and friend of Israel who inhabits the stars. This phrasing, according to the source, places him far from a specific volcano, depicting him as a cosmic, universal ruler.
And the priestly influence, removing the name from speech.
Right. The priestly caste's decision to remove the spoken name of Yahweh from common speech while retaining the YHWH spelling in the written text perhaps enhanced his mystery and power, contributing to this transformation.
So this transformation of the deity, driven by evolving beliefs, changing social structures, priestly influence, another layer of the source's argument for the fluid human development of these religious concepts.
Exactly. And finally, the source addresses prophecy itself and its alleged failure or retroactive fulfillment.
The claim being that some biblical prophecies were written after the events they purportedly predict, or that existing texts were reinterpreted later to make them seem prophetic.
Precisely. As an example, the source argues that Yahweh's threats mentioned in the Bible often describe events that had already occurred by the time the text was written, like retroactively cursing the northern kingdom of Israel, which had been destroyed in 721 BCE for not keeping laws that didn't even exist back then.
So writing history and framing it as prophecy.
That's the accusation.
Yeah.
And Jeremiah's prophecies of exile and Babylon's fall? The source claims these align so well with Kairos' conquest of Babylon that Jeremiah was retrospectively reappraised as a true prophet, suggesting the timing of the prophecy's interpretation or recording was influenced by the event itself.
Not evidence of divine foresight, but of texts being written or reinterpreted to align with past or contemporary events.
That's the source's take. This widespread redating and reinterpretation of prophecies, alongside the arguments about layered authorship and contradictory narratives, builds the source's case that the biblical texts are not infallible historical or divinely inspired documents, but complex human creations reflecting the needs and understandings of different times.
Which brings us to perhaps the most discussed and controversial figure in these narratives, Jesus.
Indeed. The source makes a very clear distinction between what it sees as a potential historical figure named Jesus and the figure presented in the Gospels. It argues that hero myths were added posthumously, obscuring this historical person.
It looks at his name first, Yeshu in Aramaic,
which became Isus in Greek and Jesus in Latin. It references a mention in the Talmud of a Yeshu Hanatzri being hanged by Alexander Yane, a Jewish king from the 1st century BC-CE. The source claims this Talmudic account is actually a hybrid of two separate executions, the Essene righteous rabbi by Yane and Jesus by Pilate, suggesting they shared a common name like Yeshu.
Okay, that's complex. What about his birth and upbringing? The source claims contradictions there too.
Big time. Matthew says his family was from Bethlehem and moved to Nazareth later to fulfill prophecy. Luke says they were from Nazareth, traveled to Bethlehem just for a census, and then returned to Nazareth.
Fundamentally incompatible origins, really.
That's what the source argues. And it suggests that the historical Jesus likely grew up in Capernaum and simply took over his father's carpentry business there.
His literacy is also questioned in the source, based on that line in John.
John 7.12, yeah. The crowd asks, how does this one know how to read, never having learned? The source interprets this as implying illiteracy, and notes that later Talmud authors apparently accepted Jesus was illiterate.
And even his appearance.
Even more strikingly, the source mentions early Roman critics like Celsus, a philosopher from the 2nd century CE who described Jesus as physically misshapen. And the source claims this description was even accepted by some early Christians like Tertullian and Origen. That's a surprising detail often overlooked in conventional narratives.
Definitely. His ancestry is another point the source examines. It claims Jesus openly admitted he was not descended from King David.
Yes, citing Psalm 110.1 as Jesus' support for this, arguing that the Messiah figure described there doesn't need to be Davidic. The source finds this admission significant because it's one of the few claims about Jesus that wasn't apparently expurgated or edited out by later redactors, potentially providing a genuine clue to the historical Jesus who, in this view, did not see himself fulfilling a Davidic lineage prophecy.
Which makes the later gospel genealogies in Matthew and Luke particularly problematic for the source.
Absolutely. Matthew and Luke provide lengthy yet incompatible genealogies tracing Jesus' lineage, but they trace Joseph's lineage despite the claim of a virgin birth, where Joseph is not the biological father.
Right, that's always been a point of discussion.
The source argues these conflicting genealogies became an embarrassment for later Christians. Leading figures like Julius Africanus in the 3rd century CE offered, well, what the source calls absurd rationalization to try and reconcile them, which eventually, according to the source, hardened into Catholic dogma.
So the source uses these details, contradictory birth narratives, questions of literacy and appearance, ancestry claims, conflicting genealogies to argue that the gospel accounts contain later layers that obscure a potentially simpler historical figure.
Moving to his teachings and practices, the source describes them as very similar to doctrines found in other Jewish groups of the time, particularly the Essenes and Pharisees.
Celibacy, for instance. You mentioned the Essenes.
Yes, the source suggests Jesus preached celibacy because he was himself an Essene, a group known for ascetic practices, including celibacy. The source also makes the rather bold claim that engaging in sexual activity with a prostitute like Mary Magdalene was not considered a sin in that society at that time and wouldn't have required anyone to retire from their religious role.
Okay. Some teachings attributed to Jesus are described as violent and apocalyptic in the source.
The source points to predictions of violence, the imminent establishment of Allah's theocracy by force, using a term from the source text that reflects a later perspective but applied to Jesus' alleged vision, and claims that one's enemies would be members of one's own household.
Wow.
The source even claims Jesus promised to end Roman overlordship and be crowned king by 120 CE, which obviously didn't happen.
What about teachings like the Golden Rule or forgiveness, the more familiar ones?
Teachings like the Golden Rule, forgiving injuries, charity, not judging others, hospitality, these are presented by the source as not peculiar to one mythology or teaching. They're seen as widely shared moral precepts found across different cultures and philosophies. The Lord's Prayer, the source notes, addresses Yahweh, using the name that was taboo only to Jews in that era, and petitions for the messianic monarchy in Jerusalem, framing it within specific Jewish eschatological hopes of the time.
The source highlights one specific teaching attributed to Jesus as particularly problematic, though.
Yes, the source calls the idea of everlasting torture of non-believers the most repulsive superstition ever created. However, it immediately raises a question about whether the historical Jesus actually preached this.
Oh, so?
It notes that the Gospel of Mark, often seen as an early source, is described by the source as a Paulinist source, reflecting the theology of Paul rather than potentially the original teachings of the Nazarites or Ebionites, who were followers of Jesus' brother Jacob. This again suggests, according to the source, later theological interpretation being attributed back to Jesus.
Right. So questioning the source of that specific teaching, what about the disciples, the 12?
The concept of the 12 main disciples is claimed by the source to have been invented after Jesus' death.
Invented? What's the evidence cited?
The inconsistent lists of the 12 disciples found across the different Gospels are pointed to.
The lists don't match up exactly.
No. The source also mentions details like the nickname Thaddeus, which it interprets controversially as meaning son of a bitch, implying illegitimacy, and claims this nickname was later changed by interpolators to make it more acceptable. Judas Iscariot's betrayal role is seen as part of the posthumous hero myth, added to fit a theological narrative rather than being a straightforward historical account.
Okay. When it comes to Jesus' healing career, the source is pretty skeptical.
It is. It notes that Herod Antipas was plotting Jesus' death, suggesting his public career, including healings, might have lasted only weeks. Alleged healing successes are compared to those of modern television faith healers, or even the success rates of chiropractic or psychiatry, suggesting they might involve stooges or genuine belief leading to psychosomatic improvement.
And time-healed conditions attributed to miraculous healing.
Linked to the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, the mistaken idea that because B happened after A must have caused B, without considering natural recovery or other factors. It's the source's attempt to provide naturalistic or critical explanations for alleged miracles, aligning with its overall argument against the supernatural claims.
Regarding his death and burial, the source provides details consistent with Roman crucifixion practices.
Yes, stating Jesus was crucified by the Romans using their standard method, nails through the wrists, died of asphyxiation, a common cause of death by crucifixion. The source notes that the fact his legs were not broken. A practice Romans used to hasten death implies he died relatively quickly, before they needed to expedite the process.
And Joseph of Arimathea's role is reinterpreted significantly.
Very much so. The source describes Joseph as a pious Jew who is not a disciple of Jesus, but actually a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. According to Jewish custom, bodies could not remain on the cross during the Sabbath. The source argues Joseph offered his tomb only for the duration of the Sabbath, as a temporary placement out of piety, not as a final burial site. He supposedly intended to return after the Sabbath to properly wash and bury the body, according to Jewish tradition.
That interpretation is radically different from the common religious narrative, where the tomb is the final resting place from which Jesus resurrected. The source's account provides an alternative, non-miraculous explanation for the empty tomb story.
It grounds the burial narrative in known Jewish customs and the practical realities of Roman rule and Sabbath laws, rather than seeing it as a specific setup for a unique resurrection event.
Okay. Following Jesus' death, the source turns its attention to the creation of what became Christianity as a religion separate from Judaism. And it gives immense significance to the figure of Paul in this process.
Paul is presented by the source not just as an important early figure, but as the true founder of Christianity as a distinct religion. Essentially the apostle of the Gentiles who broke away from the Jewish roots of Jesus' original followers.
And the source makes some strong claims about Paul, accusing him of anti-Semitism and inventing core Christian concepts like predestination.
It cites Paul's teachings, like telling slaves to obey their masters and his views on the status of women as men's property, as examples of his influence in shaping the emerging religion. His understanding of Jesus is described as seeing him strictly as Yahweh's agent, unique in degree among prophets, perhaps, but not different in substance from Yahweh himself. A view the source claims differs significantly from the later Christian doctrine of Jesus as God.
That distinction between Paul's Christology and later Christian theology is crucial to the source's argument about the evolution of Christian doctrine. The source also highlights the conflict between Paul and the original followers of Jesus, particularly the Nazarites, led by Jesus' own brother, Jacob.
Right. Paul is said to have taken a Nazarite vow, maybe to appease the zealots in Jerusalem, but was later excommunicated by Jacob, who headed the Jerusalem church, apparently for accepting Roman citizenship.
Excommunicated by Jesus' brother.
That's the claim. The source claims envoys were even sent from Jerusalem to Paul's Gentile communities to try and convert them to Nazarite Judaism, but this cooperation ceased, leading to the final split and the separate development of Christianity centered on Paul's teachings.
The source also discusses the persecution of Christians by numerous Roman emperors, noting that many Christians deliberately sought martyrdom driven by their beliefs.
And there's a controversial claim about how early Christians influenced historical accounts. The source alleges that while the Roman historian Tacitus correctly claimed Emperor Nero blamed Christians for the fire of Rome, Christian book burners later destroyed favorable biographies of Nero, leading to the now widely accepted historical narrative that Nero himself started the fire and blamed the Christians. This is presented as an example of early Christian efforts to shape historical perception by controlling information.
Wow. Okay. The Gospels themselves are argued by the source to have been written significantly later, after the Jewish War ending in 70 CE. Why then?
The source's argument is that the Gospels were composed after this major conflict, primarily to gain Roman acceptance. To do this, the emerging Christian movement needed to dissociate itself from rebellious Jews.
So distance themselves politically.
Exactly. The source claims that the Pharisees, who were seen as leaders of the Jewish resistance by the Romans after 70 CE, were retroactively made the enemies of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, which Matthew and Luke then copied. portraying Jesus as being opposed to them, thereby distanced Christianity from the groups the Romans opposed.
This paints the Gospels as complex documents with theological and political motivations, edited or composed to serve the needs of the early Christian community, trying to establish itself within the Roman Empire and distinguish itself from the Jewish population that had just rebelled.
That's the picture presented.
And this leads to a central point: how Jesus, who the source argues didn't claim to be God, came to be seen as divine.
The source is emphatic on this. It claims first-century Christians and the original Nazirite followers of Jesus did not regard him as God. Other early sources attributed to figures like Paul, Peter, Jacob, and Judas are said not to report Jesus making any claims of godship.
So where did the idea come from? The Gospel of John.
The Gospel of John is presented as the significant departure. Unlike the earlier, more synoptic sources, the Gospel of John features Jesus claiming equality with Yahweh multiple times. Famous lines like, "Before Abraham was, I am the Father are one," and Thomas's declaration, "My Lord and my God."
Why does the source find these specific claims in John so significant and potentially problematic?
The source argues that in the Jewish society of the time, making such claims of equality with Yahweh would have resulted in immediate death by stoning or tearing apart for blasphemy.
Right, a very serious charge.
Extremely serious. The fact that Jesus was not killed for claiming godship, according to the source, suggests he never made these claims. Therefore, the source concludes, these claims in John must be later additions or fabrications inserted into the narrative by the Gospel's author or later editors to promote a developing theology of Jesus' divinity. The source accuses the author of John of using earlier material but distorting it for this theological purpose.
This leads to a really powerful claim by the source about the nature of modern Christian belief.
Yes, the source essentially states that Christians today worship a man who, according to its analysis, never claimed godship, whose immediate disciples never claimed it for him, all because of theological and political decisions made centuries later by figures like Emperor Constantine and councils like Nicaea.
And the source highlights the fate of Jacob, Jesus' brother, as particularly poignant.
Right. Jacob, who saw Jesus as the Jewish Messiah and anointed king, was later claimed by the emerging Christian church as the first Christian bishop in Jerusalem. Yet, according to the source, Jacob and his lineage of Nazirite followers were eventually hunted to extinction by the very Christians who had come to accept the later doctrine of Jesus' divinity. They saw the original view as a threat to their new orthodoxy.
Hunted to extinction by later Christians. That's a stark image.
It is. This entire section paints a picture of Christianity, not as a continuous, unified tradition stemming directly from Jesus' own self-understanding, but as a religion that evolved dramatically over centuries, influenced by other belief systems, political forces, internal theological debates, culminating in doctrines like the divinity of Jesus that were simply not present in its earliest stages, according to the source's analysis.
The source also explicitly details the influence of other mythologies on the developing Christian tradition, viewing Christianity as absorbing elements from the religious landscape around it.
Definitely. It sees it as part of a broader cultural milieu.
Like Zoroastrianism. What influence did that have, according to the source?
The source cites Zoroastrianism, an ancient Persian religion, as influencing concepts found even within some Jewish groups contemporary with Jesus, like the Hasidim and Sadducees. It points to the idea of good and bad angels and dualistic concepts, the struggle between good and evil forces as having roots in Zoroastrianism.
And Buddhism.
The source suggests Buddhism influenced the Essenes' adoption of celibacy, a practice later embraced by Jesus himself, according to the source's interpretation.
And perhaps most significantly, Mithraism. That was a popular Roman religion, right?
Very popular, especially among soldiers. The source presents it as having significant influence on Christianity, citing parallels like the date of Jesus' birth being set on December 25th, a date associated with Mithras, and the winter solstice celebration of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun.
Okay, the date. What else?
Rituals involving the consumption of the god in the form of bread and wine. And even aspects of the Christian hierarchy, claiming the attire and title of the Mithraic Holy Father, were adopted by the head of the Christian church, the Pope.
Wow. Specific gospel details are also claimed to be borrowed.
Yeah, it argues that the Gospel of Luke borrowed the idea of shepherds visiting the newborn divine figure from Mithraism, and the Gospel of Matthew borrowed the concept of gift-bearing magi, the wise men, from the traditions surrounding Zarathustra, the founder of Zoroastrianism.
So these are presented as examples of syncretism, the blending of elements from different religious traditions, suggesting Christian narratives were constructed using popular motifs from other widespread myths.
That's the argument. Even a dating of Jesus' resurrection is linked to other myths in the source. The Gospel of John's dating of Jesus' crucifixion the day before Passover is claimed by the source to align with the traditional death and resurrection date of the Syrian savior god Adonis, or Adonai. The source suggests the author of John was likely familiar with the Adonis myth and intentionally aligned the events, perhaps to resonate with audiences familiar with that story.
Ultimately, the source argues that the formal definition of Christian orthodoxy, like the divinity of Jesus, wasn't just theological debate, but was heavily influenced by political power.
Absolutely. Emperor Constantine becoming Christian in 325 CE is presented as a pivotal moment, leading to the Council of Nicaea in the same year, where, according to the source, Jesus was formally defined as God, essentially settling a major theological dispute through imperial authority.
And later emperors made it compulsory.
Later Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the compulsory state religion of the Roman Empire, solidifying its position and defining what was considered orthodox.
So, the source's conclusion is pretty stark. The belief in Jesus as God, central to modern Christianity, wasn't part of the earliest understanding of Jesus or his immediate followers. It was a doctrine defined centuries later through a process involving political authority, theological debate, and councils, building upon earlier mythological motifs and developments within the community.
And the fate of Jacob, Jesus' brother and leader of the original Jewish followers who saw Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, is used as that poignant example. Though later claimed as the first Christian bishop, Jacob and the Nazarite tradition were, according to the source, hunted to extinction by the dominant Christian church that had embraced the later doctrine of divinity, effectively suppressing the original Jewish understanding of Jesus.
Okay. Before you wrap up, the source material briefly touches on other religious texts, specifically the Quran. How does it compare its view of the Quran to the Bible?
It contrasts them mainly on authorship. The Quran, dictated by Muhammad around 610 CE, is presented as having a single author, which means it lacks the kind of internal inconsistencies stemming from multiple authors and editors that the source claims are rife in the Bible.
So more unified internally, but what about its view of the world?
The source argues Muhammad's beliefs still reflect what it calls a primitive cosmography, similar in some ways to the ancient biblical view. It mentions the Quran describing a flat, immobile earth held by mountains, 7 solid domes as skies or heavens, the sun and a self-illuminating moon attached to these domes, and the earth covered by these domes.
So a similar pre-scientific cosmology despite this single authorship.
That's the claim. The source also notes the Quran refers to biblical figures and events, David, Psalms, Jesus healing and raising the dead, but interprets them within its own specific cosmological framework.
Right. Okay. This extensive analysis of the source material has taken us through a really challenging but incredibly detailed re-examination of familiar narratives.
It certainly has.
We've explored arguments that the Judeo-Christian Bible functions as a work of fiction, tracing concepts to ancient mythological roots, detailing the source's claims about theology as a tool for distortion, examining the primitive cosmology depicted in the texts.
Delving into the evolution of beliefs about gods, gender, sacrifice, and taboos, analyzing the complexities the source identifies in biblical authorship and editing.
Looking at the political dimensions of kings and messiahs, contrasting the source's view of the historical versus mythological Jesus, and tracing the formation of Christianity as a distinct religion heavily influenced, according to the source, by other traditions and political decisions.
We've really aimed to present the core arguments and supporting details from this particular source material you provided, highlighting how it seeks to challenge conventional understandings by rooting biblical narratives in older human stories, identifying alleged inconsistencies and edits, and emphasizing the historical, cultural, and even political forces that, in the source's view, shaped these foundational texts over millennia.
Understanding the potential influences from ancient myths, the layered authorship and editing processes the source claims are present, and the historical and cultural context that the source argues shape the development of these religious narratives. All of this can fundamentally change how one views the nature and origins of these texts.
Yeah, it definitely can.
The source encourages a view of them not as unified, divinely dictated history, but as complex, evolving human documents that reflect the beliefs, needs, and power structures of different societies across vast periods of time.
It certainly pushes you, the listener, to look closely at the material itself, maybe to question assumptions, and to consider alternative interpretations based on the historical and comparative evidence, at least as presented in this source.
So the final thought, really, for you to take away, given the claims in this source about the human origins, the diverse influences, the layered editing, the political shaping of these religious narratives, How does this change your view of their authority or meaning in the modern world? And how do we, as individuals seeking to be well-informed, navigate such complex and challenging historical claims,
Yeah.
especially when they touch upon deeply held beliefs?
It's definitely something to ponder long after our deep dive ends.
A lot to think about.